What if the life you call yours is only a mask? And what if the moment your mask falls, your real identity finally wakes up? Tonight, Ibn Arabi reminds you of a truth that doesn't just change your thinking, it rewrites your entire existence. Listen, every human walks carrying a story made of memories, wounds, fears, desires, victories, losses, names, and labels. A story you defend, a story you repeat, a story you think is you. But Ibn Arabi says, the veil is not the world, the veil is the story you believe about yourself, and until this story ends, you cannot begin. You were born pure, limitless, unshaped, but the world handed you a script. You are this, you are that, you can't do this, you must become that, and slowly, the true face beneath the dust was forgotten. You didn't lose your identity, you were simply buried underneath it. When Ibn Arabi writes that the seeker, that book written by the beloved, not by the world, he is reminding you that your truth was never in the words people gave you. Your truth is in the silence the world could not touch. The story ends when you stop defending your name. It ends when you stop worshiping your past. It ends when you stop performing the character the world gave you. And the moment your story dissolves, your real identity appears, not as a new person, but as pure being. Ibn Arabi says the ocean does not become the wave. The wave imagines it is separate from the ocean, but the moment the wave surrenders its shape, it returns to the infinite depth it always was. Your ego is the wave. Your truth is the ocean. You are not the one who fears. You are not the one who doubts. You are not the one who remembers the pain. These are events, not essence. Your story contains moments, but your essence contains eternity. The heart awakens when you stop asking, who was I? And you start asking, who am I when nothing remains but awareness? This is where Ibn Arabi takes you, not toward becoming someone better, but toward realizing the one who needed no improvement. When your story ends, you will feel something strange, a silence inside you that is not empty, but full, not dead, but infinitely alive, not yours, but divine. In that silence, your real identity whispers, I am the one who existed before the first chapter was written. All this time, you thought your story was your identity, but your story was only the curtain. Your truth was the light behind it. So tonight, stop repeating your story. Let the pages fall. Let the character dissolve. Let the tale end peacefully, because only in the death of the story, the birth of the self becomes possible, and when that happens, you will finally understand. Your true identity begins where your story ends. Your ego story, the veil that hides your real identity. And until that story collapses, the truth of who you are cannot appear, because every human being carries an invisible archive inside them, a collection of moments, victories, wounds, names, fears, and illusions that slowly weave themselves into a narrative they begin to mistake as their essence. And Ibn Arabi reminds us that this narrative is not your being, but merely the dust upon the mirror of your being. And as long as you keep polishing the dust instead of the mirror, clarity will forever stay distant. For the ego loves stories. It feeds on the past you replay and the future you fantasize about. It survives by convincing you that your identity is something fragile that must be protected, defended, justified. Yet the truth is that the ego is only a shadow formed when the light of the real meets the structure of the self. And shadows have no substance of their own. They only appear real when the light behind them is forgotten. So, you begin to cling to your story as if it defines you, every triumph becoming an anchor and every wound becoming a cage, until the story becomes heavier than the life you are supposed to live. And the subtle tragedy is that most people die without ever meeting themselves beyond their stories, because the world continuously teaches you to build narratives, to present a character instead of being consciousness itself, to accumulate identities instead of dissolving into presence. And so the heart becomes layered with masks, each one convincing you that you are incomplete without it. But Ibn Arabi says the real identity cannot be constructed, it can only be revealed, and revelation happens when the constructed collapses, when the noise ceases, when the story falls silent long enough for the truth to echo through you. And this collapse is not destruction, but liberation. For when the story ends, the storyteller awakens, and you realize that the I you defended for so long was never the true I, merely an echo created by experience, while the true I, the witness of all experience, unchanging, eternal, and untouched by the dramas of life. And when you begin to see this, everything you once carried so heavily starts to loosen, the fears that controlled you, the labels you wore proudly or shamefully, the judgments placed on you by others, the identity you worked so hard to maintain, all of it becomes transparent, almost unreal, like fog dissolving as the sun rises, because the moment awareness touches a story, that story loses its authority. And in the absence of story, you meet the deepest silence inside, a silence that does not lack but overflows, a silence that doesn't erase you, but expands you into something vast and intimate at the same time, something that feels like home in a way nothing else ever did. And this is where the unveiling begins, where the ego's narrative dissolves and the soul's reality emerges, where the self you constructed bows before the self that was always there, waiting patiently underneath the noise. And this unveiling is not a single moment, but a process, a continuous dying of old stories and a continuous birth of clarity, a peeling away of illusions until only the essential remains. And the essential is simple, silent, luminous, beyond form yet present in every form. And as you move deeper into this state, you realize how small your story truly was, how limited, how temporary, how fragile compared to the immensity of your inner being. And that realization does not create pride, but humility, because when the story collapses, what remains is not a superior identity, but a surrendered one, an identity rooted in the real, softer, quieter, more spacious, untouched by praise or blame, success or failure, because it no longer needs to be someone, it only needs to be. And in this beingness there is a peace the ego could never manufacture, a freedom no story could ever contain, a depth that cannot be spoken, but can only be lived. And this living becomes a form of remembrance, a constant recognition that your existence is not the story you tell, but the awareness that watches the story unfold. And this awareness is the doorway Ibn Arabi pointed toward, the threshold between illusion and truth, self and self, form and essence. And once you cross it, even briefly, nothing in your story can bind you again, because you have seen what lies beyond it. And once you have seen beyond it, you cannot go back to believing that the shadow was the source, or that the mask was the face, or that the story was the self, because the real identity begins only where the story ends, and the story ends only when you finally gather the courage to let go of who you think you are so that you may meet who you truly are in the silence that awaits just beyond the edge of your narrative, where the next moment begins but the sentence still remains unfinished. When you peel away the layers of your life, you begin to see that every experience you ever had, every joy, every heartbreak, every victory, every loss, was not random but a meticulously woven thread guiding you toward the unveiling of your real self. Because Ibn Arabi teaches that existence itself is a mirror, and every moment is a reflection designed to show you something about the truth hidden within you. Yet most people spend their lives reacting to the reflection instead of observing what it is trying to reveal, and so they get trapped in cycles, repeating the same mistakes, suffering the same wounds, carrying the same emotional burdens, because they never pause long enough to ask what the moment is trying to awaken inside them. And this is where the deeper meaning unfolds, that life is not happening to you. It is happening for you, shaping you, polishing you, breaking and rebuilding you until you become capable of seeing the reality behind appearances. And this process often feels like chaos, like confusion, like divine disruption, because the ego resists anything that threatens its control. And the unveiling of the true self requires surrender, a kind of inner softening, a willingness to release the rigid identity you cling to. And so life keeps sending you situations that challenge your assumptions, dissolve your illusions, and push you into spaces where the old you cannot survive. Because only through this dissolution can the deeper self reveal itself. And each experience, especially the painful ones, contains a hidden wisdom, a secret message encoded within it, pointing you toward the truth you keep missing while caught in emotional reactions. And when you begin to observe your experiences instead of drowning in them, a shift begins. You start to see patterns. You start to feel the lessons emerging beneath the surface. You start to understand that what you call suffering is often the sacred hammer shaping the iron of your soul. That what you call loss is often the unveiling of what was never truly yours. And what you call confusion is often the breaking of a mental framework too small to hold the next stage of your becoming. And slowly, you begin to realize that your experiences are not obstacles but teachers, mirrors, initiations into deeper consciousness, because every moment that arrives carries a divine intention, even if wrapped in difficulty. And Ibn Arabi describes this as the currents of divine wisdom flowing through the forms of life, meaning that nothing you encounter is meaningless. Everything is a sign, a symbol, a pointer toward the real, and when you understand this, your relationship with life itself changes. You stop resisting and begin receiving. You stop blaming and begin observing. You stop clinging and begin flowing. And in this newfound flow, you discover a strange and powerful clarity rising within you. The clarity that everything you went through was preparing you to meet your true identity. Not the identity formed by society. Not the identity formed by trauma. Not the identity formed by fear, but the identity woven by existence itself, the identity of the soul, vast, luminous, and unbound. And this recognition deepens when you reflect on how experiences shape your inner world, because each moment leaves an imprint, and every imprint alters your perception, and perception alters your reality. So, the more consciously you meet each experience, the more aligned your inner being becomes, until you start to live from awareness rather than reaction, meaning you no longer allow external events to dictate your internal state. Instead, you allow internal clarity to guide your external responses, and this is the beginning of true mastery, the moment when you realize that transformation does not happen by force but by awareness, not by escaping experiences, but by entering them fully, extracting their wisdom, and allowing that wisdom to reshape you from within. And as this deepening continues, you start to notice that the boundary between you and your experiences becomes softer, because the truth is that you are not separate from what happens to you. You are participating in a divine choreography where every experience helps reveal a part of you that was hidden or asleep. And when this becomes clear, gratitude starts to replace frustration, curiosity starts to replace fear, and presence starts to replace resistance. Because you finally understand that the purpose of your experiences was never to break you, but to break open the shell that hid your real essence. The essence that does not react, but witnesses, that does not cling but flows, that does not fear change, because it knows that change is the only path through which truth can be unveiled. And this unveiling is the slow awakening of the inner self, the recognition that your experiences were not defining you, but refining you. Not limiting you, but liberating you from who you thought you were, so that who you truly are could finally begin to emerge in the silent spaces where the story fades and the soul starts to speak every identity you cling to. Your name, your past, your achievements, your failures, your reputation, your wounds, your fears, is a temporary costume the soul wears while walking through the journey of this world. And Ibn Arabi teaches that these identities are necessary only until you awaken to the truth behind them, because the human being moves through life constantly shifting masks, adjusting roles, responding to circumstances, building narratives about who they are. Yet every narrative is incomplete. Every role is conditional. Every mask eventually cracks under the weight of truth. And this is where the deeper transformation begins, when life starts removing one identity after another, sometimes gently, sometimes violently, until you begin to sense the presence of something in you that does not break, does not change, does not depend on anyone's validation, something ancient, vast, and untouched by the noise of the world. And the moment you feel this presence, even faintly, a ripple begins within you, as if someone has knocked on the door of your innermost being, and suddenly you realize that everything you called me was only the surface. Only the shell, only the illusion created by memory and emotion, while the true I was silently waiting beneath, hidden by layers of conditioning and expectation. And this unveiling does not happen in a single moment, but through a series of dissolutions. Moments where life confronts you with your own limitations, forcing you to question everything you believe about yourself. And sometimes this questioning feels like identity collapse, when the version of you that you protected begins to fall apart, when old definitions no longer fit, when the ambitions that once excited you suddenly feel hollow, when the relationships that once defined you lose their meaning. And it is in these moments of inner shaking that the true identity begins to whisper through the cracks, because the breaking is not the end, but the beginning of seeing what was hidden behind the story. And Ibn Arabi describes this as the soul awakening from the dream of separation, recognizing its origin in the divine. And when this recognition touches your heart even for a moment, everything you once fought for, everything you once feared losing, begins to look small in comparison to the immensity of what you feel rising within you. And the world no longer holds the same power over your sense of self, because you start to see that you are never the limited story your mind created. You were the witness of the story all along, the awareness through which everything passed. And once you begin to experience yourself as this awareness, your relationship with your identity shifts entirely, because you no longer cling to the masks that fall away. You no longer panic when life changes direction. You no longer fear losing what was never yours to begin with. And this freedom is the first taste of the true identity, the identity that is not born and does not die, not shaped by society and not destroyed by failure, the identity that remains constant while your life moves through seasons. And the more you recognize this deeper identity, the more gracefully you begin to move through the world, because you are no longer operating from the ego's insecurity, but from the soul's clarity. And in this clarity, you realize that nothing you have ever been attached to truly defined you, not your possessions, not your status, not your relationships, not your image in the eyes of others, because all these things are temporary waves rising and falling in the ocean of existence, while your true identity is the ocean itself, vast, calm, infinite, and untouched by the turbulence on the surface. And when this realization settles into your consciousness, you begin to live differently, not out of fear, but out of presence, not out of desperation, but out of understanding. And the more present you become, the more illusions begin to dissolve, because presence reveals truth while ego thrives only in unawareness. And with each illusion that falls away, another layer of your false identity dissolves, and the soul becomes more visible, more radiant, more alive. And even the challenges you face begin to look different, because now you see them as catalysts rather than obstacles, as invitations to deepen rather than reasons to fear. And every challenge becomes a mirror showing you what part of your identity still needs to be released. And each release brings you closer to the essence within you, the essence that was there long before your story began, the essence that will remain long after your story fades. Because your true identity was never inside the story, it was behind the story, watching, guiding, and waiting for the day you would turn inward and recognize it. And when you finally feel this recognition awakening inside you, there is a strange peace, a quiet certainty, because you sense that you are finally returning to yourself, not the self shaped by the world, but the self shaped by the divine, the self that does not chase but attracts, the self that does not fear but trusts, the self that does not pretend but simply is. And in this silent beingness, you discover the truth that every saint, every mystic, every seeker eventually realizes, that the identity the world gives you is temporary, but the identity God placed within you is eternal. And the moment you begin to live from that eternal place, your entire life becomes a reflection of that truth. When the personal story ends, when the narrative you cling to dissolves, there comes a moment of terrifying clarity and breathtaking liberation where you realize that what you thought was you was simply a passing wave pretending to be the ocean. And Ibn Arabi teaches that the seeker's greatest awakening is not in learning something new, but in unlearning the illusion of separateness, because the ego is the storyteller that insists on a beginning, a middle, and an end, while the soul belongs to a realm where beginning and end do not exist. And when the ego's story collapses, the seeker does not fall into emptiness, but into a deeper, vaster identity waiting beneath all these layers. An identity that was always present but covered by roles, fears, desires, and illusions. And this is why the mystics say the true journey begins where the world believes it ends, because the end of your story is actually the clearing of a doorway, the dissolving of a veil, the pulling back of a curtain that lets you see what has been silently guiding your heart from behind the scenes. And it is in this moment of inner quiet that a new perception awakens. Not one you acquire, but one you uncover. A perception Ibn Arabi calls the divine eye, the ability to see from the place of unity instead of separation, from the ocean instead of the wave. And this shift in perception changes everything, because now you begin to understand that your struggles, your losses, your heartbreaks, your confusions, and even the moments you thought were the end were actually designed to push you back toward this point of origin. This awareness that precedes your story, and once this awareness is felt, even momentarily, you cannot return to the old.